So, when I first started playing Exceed, I would see a card in my hand that hit at the current range, or a boost that felt like it gave good stats, and just played it like a novice. Considering I literally was a novice, that was all alright. But then I started to understand the interactions between what I was going to play and what my opponent could play more. Unfortunately for me, every Exceed deck has 15 unique cards, and I had to mind-numbingly iterate through all of them in my head, for every potential action I could take, every single turn, to figure out the consequences of all my options. And thus, I entered into the realm of hour-plus long Exceed games, and the corresponding social guilt when my opponent checked their phone for the 9th time. This is not a good place to be. So if you're anything like me, allow me to save you this trouble by providing an outline of Exceed's fundamentals, and some of my personal conceptualization models. First, let's explain the normal attacks and their general uses. The normal attacks are shared across every Exceed deck, which is the primary reason why the fundamentals of Exceed exist in the first place. These 8 cards form a basic set of options available to every character, creating a base structure for the game around which specials and ultras can make things interesting, while also making sure every deck has options to deal with the game's most powerful cards. We're going to start at speed 7 and work our way down to 0. Grasp is the fastest normal, and allows you to reposition your opponent up to 2 spaces in either direction. While it nearly guarantees you a gauge, it doesn't do much damage, losing trades against both sweep and focus by a wide margin. Its boost Fierce simply provides +2 power. Cross and Assault are parallels of each other. Cross retreats after attacking, and Assault closes in before attacking. Their boosts are the opposite, with Run being an advance and Backstep being a retreat. Effectively, these give every deck 4 dash opportunities to be used for moving quickly in various combinations. A ranged keep-away character will likely strike with Cross and boost with Assault more, while a close-range grappler will more often boost with Cross and strike with Assault. You may notice that the retreat effects are greater than the advance effects, but the arena has edges, and the advantage on Assault usually grants a free extra turn at range 1, so don't think running away is fundamentally stronger than wanting to get close, because it's absolutely not. Dive always strikes me as the oddball of the normals, since it's not really part of a duo or trio of similar effects, and its attack causes polarizing results. But it's also not an easy choice to toss away like Spike, due to its boost effect. It always advances 3 and then attacks, making it effectively range 3 to 4, unless the edge of the arena gets involved. At range 4, it's an average at best gap closer, and leaves you vulnerable to counterattack. But at ranges 1 to 3, it makes you invulnerable to any attacks lower than itself, even if it doesn't hit. Its boost, Tech, discards a continuous boost from play, a necessary balance for Exceed to have powerful boost effects. Spike only hits at range 2 to 3, but absolutely crushes anything slower than itself, notably being the hard counter to block. It also has some guard to withstand a faster option. This doesn't seem to do anything yet if we look only at the normal attacks, but it matters against most fast projectiles, trust me. Its boost, Defend, grants 4 effective defense, 1 as armor and 3 as guard. Granting exactly this amount of defense, as well as the 4 defense on Spike, is an intentional design choice, but that's a more advanced topic for the next video. Sweep is the hardest hitting normal with its 6 power and discard trigger, and 6 guard is enough to absorb the vast majority of non-boosted attacks faster than it. The light boost provides +2 speed, a parallel of Grasp's +2 power. We'll be talking about Sweep a lot more later, so I'll be brief for now. Focus, with its 2 armor and 5 guard, seeks to absorb an attack and then strike back, similar to Sweep but much more defensive. It also prevents you from being moved and draws you a card with its after trigger whether you hit or not, an overall far above average attack, as long as it doesn't get stunned out. Its boost requires a longer explanation and is similar to Block's, so I'll go over Block now as obviously the most defensive option. It doesn't attack at all, instead only preventing damage at the cost of force and adding itself to your gauge. Remember, you have to not be stunned for the after effect to trigger, so if you take more than 5 incoming power, you'll have to spend force for block to go to gauge. Parry and Reading, the last 2 boosts, are similar but serve totally different purposes. Parry is an attempt to discard a card directly from the opponent's hand before they get to use it. You can use this to punish a player who chooses to hold on to cards too long, as a preemptive strike against a threat before your opponent gets to play it, or to ensure your opponent doesn't have the one option that beats a nasty threat of your own. For example, if your opponent's character has a scary boost like this one, you only have 2 dives in your deck to tech it, but you also have 2 opportunities to parry it before it's played. Parrying gives every player a method of countering intensely powerful cards, a great way of keeping a tighter game balance while allowing for strong cards to exist. Reading is more like a gotcha moment. It can only name a normal attack, but then forces your opponent to use that attack in the resulting strike, if they have a copy. You have to set your attack before you know if you were right though, so if you're wrong, your opponent can narrow down what you likely played, considering he knows what you tried to get him to play. It's often best to read opponents towards the end of their decks, especially if you haven't seen either copy of a single normal, but you can also just gamble and hope for the best. Gambling like this is particularly good while reading Spike at range 1, or Grasp otherwise, since you give up 0 information if you were wrong. Reading can also be a useful option for disarming a boosted opponent with a miss. And just like with Block, if you do get this gotcha moment, or you do gamble and succeed, it still comes at the cost of a very powerful attack in Focus itself, so it's not free to just read whenever you want to and hope for the best. If either of these name a card effects fail, it's not a total waste though. Your opponent reveals their hand to verify you were wrong, which could create a significant headache for them. If they revealed any normals, they have to worry about you having a guaranteed reading until they get rid of those cards, and you get to generally know what to watch out for in the immediate future, possibly granting a near guaranteed free hit. When this happens to you, your safer options are usually to cycle some or all of your hand with a change cards action, name Focus with a parry or reading of your own to ensure it won't be in their hand, or play on but use your normals as quickly as possible over the next few turns. And that's all 8 of the normals. Note how the faster normals typically have less guard and do less damage than the slower ones, but move things around more. This will come into play later, but for now, let's start the fundamentals with the speed curve. You can think of the speed curve as the standard for how fast an attack can reasonably be at a given range, or alternatively, what attack is safe to play to near guarantee a hit. That sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple when shown like this. At range 4, the only normal that hits is Dive, at speed 4. So at range 4 or more, the curve is speed 4. At range 3, Assault now hits at speed 5, and will stun Dive. The curve for range 3 is 5. At range 2, Cross can now hit and stun either of the 2 previous options, thus the curve for range 2 is 6. And as you could probably guess by now, at range 1, the curve is Grasp's speed 7, which will stun all of the previously mentioned guardless attacks. If you initiate a strike with an on-curve option, you're typically guaranteed to hit, barring surprises like EX attacks or an above-curve option like this one. This attack hits range 2 at speed 7, making it much riskier to strike with Cross or any other unguarded attack with lower speed, even on your own turn. There exists an above-curve attack for every range somewhere in Exceed, and learning how to think differently against characters with these options is an important part of becoming a strong player. If you play a card with less speed than the speed curve, then you're considered to be playing undercurve, but this doesn't have to be a bad thing. Many undercurve options have enough guard to absorb incoming attacks. Even undercurve options without any guard are very strong plays if your opponent plays even slower than you did. You don't really care since you're striking first, and probably winning that strike. So remember, the speed curve isn't a hard and fast rule. You shouldn't always be playing on curve or better, because an opponent who catches onto this will play slower but stronger guarded attacks, like a sweep against your Grasp. The speed curve is just a fundamental standard within Exceed, and can be used as a guide that dictates which attacks are safe, so to speak. In order to better demonstrate these interactions, next we'll go over the classic range 3 mix-up. The range 3 mix-up is an easy example which demonstrates the game theory that surrounds a strike, and a situation you'll find yourself facing very often. But first, let's conceptualize spacing. Ranges 1 and 2 are full-on melee range, with range 1 in particular being the danger zone that grappler-type characters thrive in. Range 4+ is outside of melee entirely. This is the realm of projectiles and long dash closing moves, with dive being the only normal to barely close the distance at exactly range 4. Range 3, stuck in the middle of these two, is a Goldilocks zone. It's the edge of melee range, where the vast majority of projectiles are still able to connect, but fighters are just close enough to charge in with assaults, advance over with dives, spike their opponent down, or reach out far with a crouching sweep. And thus, we have the range 3 mix-up, a lopsided rock-paper-scissors interaction between these 4 attacks. Assault is speed 5, and can usually be expected to hit due to it being on curve. It deals 4 damage and grants advantage. If the opponent plays Assault or Dive, he gets stunned, and if he plays Spike, he will miss. But if he sweeps, the Assault will get punished back with 6 damage and discarding a card. This is a loss for the Assaulter, but not a very bad one. Sure, he took more damage and lost a card, but the bare minimum benefit from advantage is preparing to draw 2 cards, so we'll call this trade roughly even, maybe a minor loss. Dive is the second fastest attack. Its interactions with Dive and Spike are similar to our first example, but a defensive Assault will crush it. However, Dive will cross over and become immune to that nasty sweep, dealing 5 damage and scoring an outright victory. Spike similarly handles being thrown against itself in sweep, except this time leaving you at range 3 rather than crossed over at range 1. However, it loses hard to both the defensive Assault or Dive, making it even less safe than Dive unless you really predict a slow play. And lastly, if you throw a sweep at range 3, you lose terribly hard to Dive and Spike, but trade quite favorably against an opposing Assault, since the opponent doesn't get any benefit from advantage. It's his turn next either way. Also, unlike the other 2 cases, where an attack outright beats itself on initiation, Sweep trades against another sweep, dealing 6 damage to each player and knocking a card out of both of their hands. And so, the game theory charting of the range 3 mix-up looks like this, at least in a vacuum. Assault beats Dive and Spike beats Sweep, and Sweep beats Assault. Kinda. Also, Assault, Dive, and Spike all beat themselves, while Sweep trades against another Sweep equally. This is the foundation for all of Exceed, the interaction between fast, slow, and mid-speed attacks. Now, as I go over this concept, just remember that there are always exceptions, especially when it comes to differing ranges, costs, trigger effects, and character differences. But as you're beginning to learn, this framework provides a great baseline for understanding the game. Fast attacks are usually those which are on curve, above curve, or at worst slightly below curve, with no armor or guard, and often with some kind of movement effect. They seek to always hit first, especially on initiation, and hopefully stun or avoid retaliation. Fast attacks beat other fast attacks, usually beat mid-speed attacks, and usually trade unfavorably against slow attacks. They don't typically win very hard, but they're generally safe to throw. Slow attacks are the opposite of fast attacks. They are typically speed 1 or 2, rarely perform movement, hit or trade very well, and come with plenty of armor or guard to absorb an incoming attack. Slow attacks absorb fast attacks and then strike back harder, they trade against themselves, and they often lose to the mid-speed attacks, at least the ones that are designed to beat them. Slow attacks almost never win cleanly, but they can definitely put you ahead of the opponent in a trade. Mid-speed attacks you can think of as hard punish attacks. As the name implies, these are under curve but faster than slow attacks, usually speed 3 or 4, but they can be slightly faster or slower even. Mid-speeds are made to cleanly beat certain or most slower attacks through having enough power, ignoring guard, or dodging out of the way. But they're unsafe, usually losing cleanly to faster attacks because they have no guard or because those faster attacks will move out of range, like we saw with Spike earlier. This fast-slow mid-speed framework also helps us understand projectiles better. Fast projectiles are speed 5 or more, but don't come with much power. These stun assaults and dives, but their power isn't enough to break through slow projectiles or guarded mid-speeds like Spike. Slow projectiles usually carry at least 5 guard and also hit hard, basically saying you better have an assault or dive ready at all times or you're going to lose this trade. Mid-speed projectiles don't really exist in a true form often, but the theory is still the same. They lose to fast, and they win against slow. Projectiles are much more varied in their effects and interactions because of how important movement and spacing is outside of range 3. So don't worry about applying the fast-slow mid-speed framework to these perfectly. You can always calculate the chart for how your projectiles stack up against your opponents before the game begins. And there you have it, those are the basics. As long as you know the speed curve, the range 3 mix-up, and the broader fast-slow mid-speed framework, you can generally get a taste of what most attacks are useful for and where they have their shortcomings. I know that I would have loved to have an explanation like this when I first started Exceed, so I really hope that this helps you out. Please let me know if it did in the comments below, and as always, I will see you next time.